I'm your host, Geoff Shullenberger, and this is Compact Conversations, the podcast where I sit down with one of Compact's contributors to discuss one of our articles. This week I'm joined by Kyle Baasch, who has just written an essay for us under the title Too Late for Late Capitalism, which is a review of the new book Immediacy by cultural theorist Anna Kornblue. So thanks for joining me, Kyle.
Thanks for having me here.
So the subject, as the title suggests, is late capitalism in quotation marks. So one of the things your piece does is kind of provide a genealogy of this concept, which is really quite ubiquitous. In fact, within a day of when your piece appeared, we also published a review of the new controversial book White Rural Rage, which is from a very different orbit, although left of center, but sort of mainstream liberal pundits. Not Marxists at all, but nevertheless, it also uses the term late or late stage capitalism. So this term is used quite widely and, bandied around quite a bit. I've been noticing this for decades, honestly. So as I said, one of the things your piece does that I think a lot of people might not be familiar with is provide a genealogy of this phrase and this concept. So perhaps to start, if we could just kind of recap that history.
Sure. So usually, a lot of the time when the phrase late capitalism is used, it's just completely undefined and it's supposed to sort of be self-explanatory. But if you get a book by an academic on the concept of late capitalism, they'll always admit that the term is very old because they've done their homework and they've gone onto Wikipedia. And there's usually some kind of footnote where they say, I know people have been using this term for about 120 years, and here we are, it's still capitalism. But what I wanted to stress in this first half of the essay is that the term, as it was used from about 1902 to 1980, didn't just convey the author's feeling that capitalism is about to end and that we're in this kind of final moment of it. It meant something much more specific, situated within this 19th century German Romantic historiographic tradition out of which the term comes. So in this tradition, this is the genealogy that I try to give in the piece, it's assumed that historical totalities resemble the lives of an individual human being that passes through these different phases of infancy and maturation and senescence, and they have almost a kind of psychological character to them. And you see this especially frequently in art history. We speak of the High Renaissance or the Late Gothic. That's where Zombart gets this kind of periodizing schema from. It was very prominent in this sort of art historical discourse. And what this means is that the idea of rigidity, brittleness, regularity, artificiality, this kind of appearance of what senescence or senility is supposed to look like is kind of baked into Zombart's vision of what lateness is. So even though Zombart's basic argument is that high capitalism is something that occurred in the 19th century and it was associated with laissez-faire economic policy, and late capitalism is in the 20th century and it's has more government intervention into the economy, and there's this kind of disintegration of the entrepreneurial ethos of capitalism in its high stage. His idea is not simply that centralized administration has to follow free enterprise and this kind of iron law of economics in the Marxist sense, although he does believe this. But more important to his vision is that this 19th century form of capitalism in its sort of individualistic form is the adulthood of capitalism, the full actualization of its potential as an ideal form. And that late capitalism, which follows it, is this kind of form of senility and exhaustion of the inner potential of the system, just as an art movement like Mannerism is a kind of exhaustion of the potential of Renaissance's classical ideals. Don't quote me about my 16th century painting knowledge, but it's the same kind of vision of something growing old and dying. So I'm just stressing all of this aesthetic dimension because I want to make clear that the impetus to periodize a world as late in the German tradition is grounded in this perception of the world as growing old in the manner of a living creature. For most of the sociologists writing in Zombart's time, up until the 60s and 70s, this is kind of agreed upon, that the bureaucratic state and centralized administration has this sort of appearance of oldness and rigidity. Anyway, so that's an important part of my genealogy that's mentioned very quickly, to just sort of flesh out how it moves beyond Zombart into the middle of the century. In Adorno's writings, Adorno is sort of usually attributed with repopularizing this term, although the term actually only occurs a few times in his entire 10,000 pages of collected writings. But he has a very important essay called Late Capitalism in Industrial Society. Throughout the course of the 40s and 50s, he uses this term occasionally to refer to the totally administered society is his much more famous concept. Late capitalism is a kind of synonym of that. But in any case, he's using it in the same way as Zombart. It's his sort of prototype for what late capitalism is Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. This is a book that's very important to him. It's, this vision of humans being manufactured in test tubes and their behavior is conditioned through these kind of Pavlovian techniques, and they have no conception of suffering because all of their needs are constantly satisfied by this bureaucratic apparatus. So in any case, that's sort of what he has in mind. And he revitalizes the concept in this 1968 meeting of the German Sociological Association, where he's the president at the time, and he gives the keynote address, and he's also the organizer of this conference. It was a very significant conference because it was for the first time this Sociological Association decided to open up the doors to the public, and this was a very heated moment in Europe. It's April 1968, and there's a lot of student activists there, and so it was very highly publicized. People were aware that there was this kind of Spätkapitalismus debate in Germany going on with these sociologists. And so anyway, the point of his lecture, his keynote address, is just to clarify that late capitalism, or capitalism as such, is still relevant to the post-war European welfare state, which to many people didn't even seem capitalistic anymore. He recognizes that the concept of capitalism has this kind of implication of contradictions to it, whereas post-industrial society, or rather industrial society, does not. So he wanted to suggest that, yes, even in 1968, society is still contradictory and we can still call it capitalistic. And my understanding is that Ernest Mandel, who was working on his dissertation, and he was an activist in Germany and in France and maybe in Belgium, I'm not sure where he was living in 1968, but he was aware of Adorno's lecture. And I think in May or June of 1968, he publishes something in which he talks about all the German sociologists that are talking about Spätkapitalismus now. And that's where he gets the idea to name his dissertation Late Capitalism, which as a periodizing term means something slightly different than it did for Zombart. It refers to something that's happened since 1940 or 1945, whereas Zombart believed that late capitalism began in 1914. But this image of bureaucracies, of rationality, of this kind of administrative state is still much prominent in Ernest Mandel's understanding of what late capitalism is. So that's the bulk of my genealogy, and then there's this next chapter to this of how Jameson enters into the equation and totally distorts this long-standing meaning that was consistent for about 80 years.
Right. So I think those of us who go to graduate school as you are and as I did, maybe the most canonical text in recent decades that sort of foregrounds this concept of late capitalism is the essay then turned book by Frederick Jameson, Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. So it seems clear that this is sort of the more immediate source of people's deployment of this term, although again, I don't think the authors of White Rural Rage are referencing Jameson. One thing that's kind of interesting here is, in the debates around Jameson's formulations about postmodernism, and this might sort of give a concrete reference that would be interesting, is these discussions about the Pruitt Ego housing complex in St. Louis, right, which is one of these kind of mid-century, planned housing estates for the working class, the poor. And then it sort of becomes blighted and is demolished in the early to mid 70s. I can't remember exactly the year. And so, this is taken and discussed often as this kind of turn away from modernism to postmodernism. And Jameson identifies this, turn away from modernism, and then, he of course discusses the hotel, the Buenaventura Hotel in Los Angeles as sort of his quintessential example of postmodern architecture. And of course, the early discussions of postmodernism almost entirely revolve around architecture before, and they really have to do with this turn away from the kind of grand planned utopian sort of modernist architectural projects, which were part of this kind of notion of in a sense, a managed capitalism, right? They were a sort of concrete manifestation of a state that was, no longer just a kind of laissez-faire entrepreneurial society, but instead one in which you had these kind of planners who were, managing, and allocating resources and so on, right? So this demolition of this housing project is, sort of taken as a visible, which then occurred at other, in other kinds of similar projects around the U.S. and elsewhere, and is sort of taken as a moment of the, that marks the decline of this sort of at least this positive vision of a sort of managed capitalism, right? Of sort of the, the welfare state, social democracy, these kinds of notions that might be attached to that. And so what's interesting here, I guess I'm trying to suggest is, that what Jameson sort of formulates as the turn towards late capitalism, which would sort of be marked by this type of moment, right? The sort of failure of these projects of the sort of administrative or sort of managed, administered or managed society, and sort of disillusionment about that would be, in his account, a sort of periodization where that, that's where we enter late capitalism. But strangely, by the account you're giving, it would actually be precisely the opposite, right? That would be the moment when we're leaving behind this this notion of a managed society, and this, of course, is usually or often associated with the turn towards neoliberalism. So according to your account, neoliberalism and late capitalism would seem to be opposed or in tension, whereas in Jameson, the account that Jameson ends up sort of canonizing, neoliberalism and late capitalism essentially become synonymous, right? And are used almost interchangeably by quite a few
That's exactly
commentators.
Right. Yeah, it's puzzling because Jameson, you're right, he doesn't just use the term late capitalism in a sort of misleading or wrong-ish way. He uses it in precisely the opposite sense that it had been used for about 78 years or 80 years or however long. He's trying to demarcate a moment when something is changing. He's recognizing it in the architecture. He's sort of alluding to it in the economy. And what he's marking a turn away from is precisely what the entire tradition called late capitalism. And then he calls this new moment late capitalism. It doesn't make any sense. I don't know that he necessarily uses it as a synonym for neoliberalism, although that's definitely how it's used in almost all literature today. And if any serious academic is pressed to give a definition of what late capitalism is, they'll just give you the kind of standard version of neoliberalism. That's what Anna Kornblue does in her book. But it is very strange. It's also puzzling insofar as Jameson should have known better. He was the expert on Adorno at the time, or maybe not the expert, but had written so much about the Frankfurt School. He is aware of how Adorno uses the term. In his book on Adorno, Late Marxism of all titles, we can talk about that later if we want to. He refers to Adorno's uses of the term late capitalism all the time, and it seems to have a pretty good understanding of what Adorno means by the term. So it's just strange that he would decide to use this term as a synonym for, if not neoliberalism, at least whatever comes after what Adorno called late capitalism. That's what Jameson calls late capitalism. I mean, I should say that Jameson is sort of famously sloppy for doing these sorts of things. I hope that doesn't offend any of his fans. I know that he has so many of them, and I have friends that study with him, but this is just how he operates, using terms in this very kind of conceptually imprecise way and citing the wrong thinkers at the wrong time. I mean, in the 1984 New Left Review essay on postmodernism, he says that he attributes the term late capitalism to Mandel, and he doesn't seem to know what Mandel was arguing, but he has a sentence or two in which he says, I read this great book by Ernest Mandel, and he talks about late capitalism as being this pure form of capitalism, and it's what a great term. And then 7 years later, in the 1991 expansion of this into a monograph, he attributes the origin of the term to Adorno and Horkheimer. He says the term was coined by the Frankfurt School. He had 7 years to write this book. He could have asked one economic historian who coined the term. Everyone knows that it's Zombart's term. Zombart is famous for this. It's his most signature concept, is the early high late typology. It's very unfortunate that such a stupid mistake has had such tremendous success over the past 40 or so years in academic writing and in just kind of popular cultural criticism as well.
So I wonder if part of the appeal is, this kind of dislocation around the end of the Cold War that, basically that, prior to that, you had different sort of, contested periodizations and notions of some sort of teleological development, right? And certainly on the left, you had some kind of notion that even if the Soviet Union had sort of gone in the wrong direction in its attempt to implement, sort of Marxian ideas, it at least, suggested a necessary direction of history that, had to be taken up in some way. And so once that evaporates, it sort of, dissolves this whole set of teleological schemas, which even if they weren't sort of enthusiastically used by much of the sort of intellectual left, for some time before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, at least they sort of had, they had some kind of placeholder for this idea that, that there was some sort of historical evolution we were undergoing. And so, once we get to the end of the Soviet Union, we have, actually this sort of teleological model embraced, most famously by Francis Fukuyama, who's, basically telling us that actually this sort of Hegelian model, it, is being borne out, but it's being borne out insofar as the sort of, Western liberal capitalist democratic model is winning out over all the alternatives, and that this, shows us something intrinsic in the logic of history itself. So, this whole, and this is formulated around, I guess, in between Jameson's first essay and his book, book length expanded version of it in 1991. Fukuyama's essay appears in 89. So, basically, these are sort of both, and it's interesting. I mean, they're both these kind of very notable essays that then are expanded into a book right around this moment. So, it's kind of an attempt to deal with this question of, where are we going? What period are we living in? Fukuyama has his answer. Jameson offers an answer that seems, I mean, partly because it has a kind of vagueness. And I suppose what's kind of interesting about postmodernism and his conception is that it is a kind of, it's a kind of temporally, it's characterized. I'm not describing this well, but if you think about architecture, right, the postmodern architecture is a sort of hodgepodge of different styles, right? It's characterized by eclecticism, by an emphasis on sort of decor over functional logic, and that's the most basic way that it rejects the modernist paradigm, right? Where there's this kind of paring down of ornaments towards this kind of this dream of pure functionality. Whereas postmodernism, in architecture, reintroduces ornament, and by doing that, it kind of creates this sort of temporal hodgepodge where it can have flourishes from different architectural, historical, artistic periods kind of juxtaposed with each other, right? And so postmodern in this formulation is characterized by a kind of loss of any inexorable logic of history, right? Where it's just everything kind of mixed up. Of course, it's also characterized by retro by retromania, as it's later described, which Jameson discusses at length, by nostalgia, and by these cultural products that try to capture and recreate the aesthetic of previous eras. So it's characterized by this kind of constant repurposing of past aesthetics. So anyway, I mean that sort of brings us to quite a meta level, but part of what seems notable to me here is Jameson is sort of saying, well, it's postmodernism, the sort of late capitalist era, which becomes this sort of placeholder phrase, is actually kind of characterized by the loss of any sense of inexorable historical development, in terms of at least aesthetic style, right? That prior to that, there's
Right.
this notion, you can think here of various different media, right? You can think of music, right, where there's this notion of which would be important to somebody like Adorno, right? This notion of the kind of development of Western music, right, through sort of tonality, then into atonality and Schoenbergian sort of 12-tone composition. And so this notion of these paradigms that kind of work themselves out according to an internal logic and eventually enter into a crisis and are succeeded by the erection of a new logic that in some sense kind of sublates the previous one. So what's notable about the postmodern aesthetic is this kind of loss of any particular kind of governing intrinsic logic in favor of this kind of eclecticism and constant kind of repurposing of prior aesthetics, juxtaposition of seemingly incongruent aesthetics. So I don't know, I mean, part of what seems interesting here is that the term itself is a kind of repurposing of the sort, right, which is sort of being misapplied, but in a way that's sort of consistent with the thing that Jameson's formulation seems to be trying to describe, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he's trying to, the main characteristic of postmodernity, I think the kind of textbook definition, and maybe this is not his, but Lyotard's before him, is the loss of historicity. And this is this idea that becomes so important for his understanding of style, is that the past just becomes kind of a trove of these dead styles that can be sort of cited. They lose their spiritual sort of substantiality and just become referential signifiers, essentially. And yes, this is coupled with this kind of interest in it's paradoxical to periodize a phase of history as being the phase in which one loses all sense of history. Although I don't think it's contradictory. I think it makes sense that you could think of a phase of the development of capitalism, for example, as being logical, but also transforming individuals into a certain kind of creature that don't understand the logic of the process. I think that's a lot of what Jameson is trying to do in sort of the better parts of this book. And I actually think that's what Anna Kornblue is sort of trying to do as well, understand how this phase that we're in right now has a logic to it that nevertheless we are blind to because of how successful this logic is. I also should say, just because this is what my research has been on for the past couple of years, that this whole idea of a loss of historicity and style just becoming this sort of kind of eclecticism is the main thesis of Oswald Spengler's first volume of Decline in the West and his 200 pages in the center of the book on the history of the arts. It's that this is what modernity is. He doesn't call it postmodernity. This is the modern problem, is that we lose all sense of style and all kind of substantiality of style. You see this in Zimmel as well. You see this in all sorts of cultural critical writers from the 1920s. So I think we tend to attribute a little bit too much to Jameson when we recognize this as a phenomenon of the 80s or the 90s or something like that. It's been kind of a vision of modernity that people have had for a long time. It could be understood in a number of ways. For Spengler, obviously, it refers to the decline of civilization when you no longer have this understanding of style as being something that's rooted in the community or in the nation or whatever, of just being a kind of signifier. This is when things get really bad and end. You could also think of it in a kind of this Hegelian Fukuyama-ish Judeo-Christian universal history where the loss of historicity is maybe something that could be celebrated. It's this kind of happy-go-lucky end of history. We can cite any sort of cultural artifact at will and We're no longer beholden to this um, kind of self-moving process anymore. That's a kind of optimistic image of what postmodernity is that has been successful in art history and in cultural theory.
Right, and I think some criticize Jameson for being too complacent. I mean that Pruitt ego housing complex, has been the subject of a lot of debate because there's kind of this idea that, oh, this is just some sort of inevitable, aesthetic evolution towards postmodernity, whereas this, I suppose, some of the more kind of hardline materialist Marxists will just sort of say, no, that's ridiculous. This is part of a political and material project. So it's ridiculous to kind of see that as fundamentally an aesthetic development rather than as a sort of social and political one.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean that's kind of one debate, and then Jameson is sort of seen by some as just kind of complacently acquiescing to this development, and I mean we should get into Kornblue because that's the the main subject of the piece. It seems from your description that she's not she's not at all celebratory of this moment that she's attempting to describe as too late capitalism in her title, which clearly is an invocation of Jameson's. She's quite withering about various kind of luminaries of prose, of the arts in the contemporary world, some of the most praised figures. And so, she does seem to be trying to, mount a kind of criticism of this this moment in aesthetic terms, rather than just kind of, trying to describe it in a detached way. So, that's sort of one thing that struck me here. But then your argument is that her own prose sort of often exhibits the very qualities that she is attacking, which seems to be part of the point of what she's doing, or seems to be at least partly deliberate, as I understand it. So anyway, I mean,
Well,
yeah.
How do you understand that? I wonder this. I often am very anxious that I just have no sense of humor, and there's just this incredibly clever sort of parody going on in the style of her book. I have some theories about the deliberate dimension of why the book is written this way, because she mentions it in a few places. But how do you see it as being deliberate, I wonder?
Well, I should be clear here that I have not read the book. So
Okay.
I've read, I read your piece and a couple things about it, and so I've read quotes from it, but I have not read the book. So I'm sort of trying to gather what I understood from your analysis, rather than sort of making my own independent assertion here.
Right. I mean, so I identified the book as being a symptom of this sort of epidemic of immediacy that she's trying to address. Whether or not this epidemic is actually an epidemic is another question. But insofar as we can accept that there's been this movement toward culture that is immediate in the sense that she defines it, things like streaming and first-person narration and fiction, and I don't know, Kim Kardashian's book of selfies called Selfish. If we accept that these things will have something in common, that just this new trend that's just sort of absorbing us, sucking us into this material without allowing us to perceive broader social relations behind the cultural artifact, then yeah, I think that Kornblue is guilty of this insofar as the book does really invite this very kind of lazy, detached reading. I mean, it's not just lazy and detached. It's the book so heavily relies on onomatopoeia, of using these kinds of I call them jacuzzi jargon, but these just words that have this kind of gushiness to them to be able to describe, the liquid flowing, rushing elements of our current system. It becomes a kind of song in this sense. And I've actually, for the past couple of weeks, I've had so many different lines from this book stuck in my head. It kind of has that effect on one. I saw a post on X about it where someone said, immediacy has some really great tracks, but that's kind of how people read it. It's an album essentially. But In terms of the deliberateness of this style, no, obviously she doesn't want the book to be read this way. She wants it to be difficult and challenging and make you pause at the end of every sentence and say, now what is she trying to communicate here? Let's unpack this. This is the reason for all of these neologisms and just always finding the wrong word to use in every single sentence. She wants to kind of trip you up a little bit and distort the transparency of communication insofar as transparency and making your ideas comprehensible is guilty of immediacy in the sense that she defines it. She mentions at one point, I think early on in the introduction, that she wants to give immediacy a style makeover through her nerdy prose. I don't really know what this means. It's just, this is the way that she writes, but there's this intention to sort of surprise the reader with this extremely high octane theoretical jargon that they're just so not used to seeing in the auto theory of Paul Preciado and Maggie Nelson and whoever else. I don't know that this strategy is effective. I think it's very ineffective, but I think this is why the book is written this way. On the other hand, this is how she writes in all of her university press monographs. And this is becoming a dominant style of academic writing beyond just this one disastrous book. And that's one thing that I really wanted to draw attention to in this piece, is that this is what it looks like to be a Marxist in an English department these days, is to be trained to write in this way. And it's just horrifying to me.
I was struck by the paragraph in which you describe the moments in the book where she breaks with this kind of set of stylistic habits and enters into a different sort of register. And so I'll just read this part of your essay. Kornblue only deviates from this mannered style when referencing current events. Shit is very bad, she laments, and we find marbles of the shit scattered throughout the book in the form of hysterical non sequiturs. 1 in 5 students pursues treatment for climate grief. The University of Chicago and Temple University have the largest private police forces in the country, and they actually shoot people. A small number of hyper-consuming billionaires have irreparably degraded the planet. Ergo, billions of people will be displaced and killed. Notice how these allusions to suffering are delivered with an inappropriately blasé intonation, as though reality were something foreign that one learns about in Vox headlines. So I was struck by this, which seemed very familiar to me just from academic politics, left of center politics more generally, that, you may have all of these kind of theoretically, terminologically sophisticated analyses, but much of if you actually drill down to the political views, they tend to be universally quite banal and sort of predictable from whatever you would find on the kind of midwit sort of online punditry that you associate here with Vox. So I mean, I'm kind of I was struck by that, but then you also kind of point out that this seems to be the place where some sort of reality enters, but it enters in this strange way, as if, as you say, sort of mediated through these Vox headlines, or these sort of op-ed type takes that that sort of frame reality and interestingly frame it through these kind of quite facile moral judgments that I think come through in these examples. So I don't know if there's more in there that you didn't get to in this piece, but I was curious about that dimension of the book.
Yeah, I mean, what interests me more than the fact that these are facile judgments is that they're integrated into the book in such an unusual manner, in that they don't really have anything to do with this argument that she's trying to make about the culture of immediacy or transformations of the global economy over the past couple of decades. They kind of fall like asteroids in the middle of random paragraphs and just puncture this kind of really theoretically dense hermeticism of this book with such kind of nonchalant sort of it's tonally dissonant with the rest of the book in such an obvious way, and also kind of bogus. I mean, the first one, 1 in 5 students seeks treatment for climate grief. That's utterly absurd. You go to the source, there's a footnote for this. It says 1 in 5 students seeks treatment for depression. It's the kind of scholar that she is, though. But the book is just filled with this kind of stuff. But I find this very typical of this style of academic writing, in that these references to reality, they have to be there. They're just required to let you know how righteous the writer is. But they occur in such a strange manner like this. I mean, I really wish that, I hope that listeners will acquire this book in some way or another. Chapters of it have been published over the past several years in various forms. So there's ways to do this. And just look at how a paragraph is strung together. It's just so fascinating to see. There's bits of meme language. I didn't really get to this, but you'll be reading a paragraph and suddenly she'll say, "Sir, this is not an Arby's," or "Sir, this is an Arby's." I don't know the meme, but there'll be like a phrase like that. And then it gets back into the dense theoretical stuff. And then you get this kind of Vox headline. And then it's all kind of one non sequitur after another in this just bizarre sort of structure. That's how the entire book is structured. I don't know that I have more to say about it, but I do find it fascinating. And also just so typical in a way that's really disturbing to me.
So coming back to the question of periodization, the one thing that you note in the book is that the idea of late capitalism, as it's originally formulated by Zombart, is kind of that this entrepreneurial spirit sort of runs out, and eventually because it's characterized by this kind of more youthful vigor, and then it is eventually kind of inexorably replaced by this more managed sort of system. This, as an aside, this kind of reminded me of Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks, where you get this kind of in a way this you get this family portrait of different generations, and it's really more or less this idea. It's this sort of Hamburg bourgeois family, and they go from being the sort of founder figures of this family firm, or these kind of vigorous, robust entrepreneurial figures, and then they gradually decline into decadence. So in any case, it's kind of this organic, as you said, it's this kind of organicist idea that was so common in that period, and then it's sort of picked up by Marxists to describe this transition, which, as you said, they really see coming to fruition in the post-war era. And then this periodization kind of enters the lexicon of the sort of contemporary generation of sort of theorists through Jameson, as we discussed. And I suppose and then another note that you have is that actually the neoliberals were very concerned to the actual neoliberals, the Milton Friedmans and sort of Chicago boy types, were very concerned to discredit this idea of a periodization, right, or of a sort of inexorable development away from the vigor of entrepreneurialism. They saw it as possible to resurrect this more entrepreneurial spirit, and desirable to do so, right? So that's another way that this this moment of the transition to neoliberalism seems in one analysis to be precisely the kind of discrediting of this idea. But I was curious, so I think you bring up that Kornblue isn't the only recent sort of verso author who's using this language of lateness, late capitalism, right? It just keeps being used. So there's this drive towards periodization that persists in this weird kind of undead way. And I'm curious, and this is just a sort of concluding question. Do you think there's something misguided? Is this drive towards periodization kind of ultimately to link to this organicist conception, and therefore something that a more serious analysis should actually try to avoid, and and sort of eschew, or are there other approaches to periodization that might get us out of this rut of talking endlessly about late capitalism that that this book exemplifies?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, it seems to me, just as a side note to refer to something that you just said, I mean, one of the reasons that Cornblue wrote this book is the feeling that we're not periodizing enough, is that we've just kind of lost any comprehension of where we find ourselves in the course of world history. And my sense is that a serious, common, popular cultural phenomenon right now is that everyone's periodizing all the time, even in a very sloppy way. But the ubiquity of the term late capitalism in news headlines, just even over the past week, you find an article in Washington Post, an article in The Nation referring to lemonade at Panera Bread being an example of late capitalism. People want to, identify everything as being representative of where we find ourselves in history. And you see this, the 1619 Project is a different kind of version of this, but this sort of revival of the meta-narrative that Jameson and Lyotard and these people said had kind of died with postmodernity is coming back in a very interesting way. And I'm highly sympathetic to it. I actually have an extremely high tolerance for someone like Zombart's or Spengler's kind of organicist understanding of how history develops, even if they're both wrong in their own ways. It has great heuristic value to ask yourself whether or not it's possible that the phase that we're in now is a logical, organic continuation of the previous phase. And in many instances, you'll find out that it's hard to make this argument, but it's a good starting point, I think, to try to make this argument, because generally speaking, in cultural theory, the starting point is to say that history has no continuity whatsoever. It's just all kind of contingent ups and downs. And when you start that way, it's hard to lead yourself back to the very basic insight that perhaps there is some kind of organic logic to history. So I'm very interested in supporting this as much as possible, while also retaining the important criticisms, the epistemological criticisms of Karl Popper and Hayek when they criticize directly Zombart and Spengler and this whole tradition, Hegel and Marx most of all, for being really kind of philosophically, methodologically sloppy in their just kind of assumption that history moves in this organic manner. So I have a lot of sympathy and understanding for the impulse to periodize and to call our current period late. It feels like we're living at the end of the world to so many people. Maybe this is a misguided assumption, but it's certainly true that people just feel this way. This is what late capitalism, I think, means to almost everyone. It only ever occurs in like news stories about something kind of apocalyptic. There was a story a couple of days ago about a CVS in the DC area where all of the items had been stolen except for the things behind plexiglass. And the title is, the late capitalist horror story of the CVS in the DC area. Now, what does this actually have to do with capitalism or late capitalism for that matter? But it does have this kind of apocalyptic sort of vision to it, image to it, that there's like a CVS that has nothing on the shelves. It seems like the end of the world. I think that we're just much too quick to ally this sort of apocalyptic, catastrophic feeling with this stupid optimism that this has to do with capitalism dying and giving birth to a new higher phase of society. So I don't know, I have mixed feelings about all this kind of impetus for periodization, I guess.
Right. I mean, the obvious other way to think about it would be that, capitalism produces crises as part of, as part of its basic nature, and that, the things that are being described as late are sort of crises that it is, essentially generating, but, also by its nature, it sort of moves forward by, sort of recontaining and absorbing the crisis into the kind of next phase of its functioning. So right, there is this kind of weird combination of apocalypticism, but then also a kind of optimism, right? That somehow this must mean that we're near a breaking point. Things can't go on like this. Which, I suppose those have in common a kind of fatalism or passivity, that they're kind of tied to this idea that, well, things are just unfolding, and and of course you get these ideas that which are like either the world's going to end, or we get, in 7 years or whatever from climate change, or we get, luxury socialism. And those are sort of the only two alternatives.
All right.
So,
Yeah, I mean, to make one more point on this old famous Gramsci phrase that's become so popular over the past several years, past decade or so, the old is dying and the new cannot be born, and we're in this interregnum with all sorts of morbid symptoms. I mean, that metaphor there of both death combined with this kind of maternal image of this womb is quite a bizarre metaphor that was actually quite ubiquitous during Gramsci's time. Ernst Bloch uses this metaphor very frequently as well. It's all over the place, but that's sort of the image that people have today, that we're in this system that's 145,000 years old, and it's trying to give birth to its baby because apparently that's it's having some kind of geriatric pregnancy or something like that. But this is sort of the basic guiding image of where we find ourselves right now. The old is dying and the new cannot be born. I think it's just logically kind of problematic to view the world in that way, but for better or for worse, that's what people tend to see for some reason.
All right, well, we will leave it there. So thanks so much for joining me for this and for contributing this review.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
So that is it for this week's Compact Conversations. Thank you, Kyle. And as always, remember, Compact is an independent reader-supported publication, and we need your subscriptions to keep doing what we're doing. Subscribing for just $9 a month or $90 a year gets you full access to all our content, as well as priority access to our events. Please also remember to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite channels, and if you like what we're doing, to give us 5 stars. Thanks, and see you next time.